You are 15, barefoot on marble that gleams like frozen moonlight. The air inside the Château de Versailles smells of lilies, powder, and something faintly sweet decay hidden under perfume. Candles shimmer in endless rows of mirrors, each reflection multiplying your fear 100-fold. You've been told to smile when the Marquis passes. His wig gleams whiter than bone, his breath smells of wine and sugared rot. Laughter drifts through gilded doors where nobles whisper of favors and debts. Behind silk curtains, the rustle of dresses sounds like wings caught in a snare. A lady's jeweled hand slides across your shoulder, measuring, approving, pricing. You stand very still, because even trembling can be mistaken for invitation. Here, the body is coin, and your innocence, an investment. As harps echo down the corridors, you realize the truth. This paradise of mirrors is a perfumed prison, where pleasure is policy and love is lawless. History remembers the music of Versailles, not the screams it muffled. If these buried truths pull you in, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. It fuels the next unearthing. Beneath the elegance of France's royal courts, from Louis XIV to Louis XVI, pulsed an empire of seduction and surveillance. Behind every masquerade and midnight ball lay a system, meticulously recorded in the archives of La Police des Mœurs, the registers of pleasure, and private journals locked away for centuries. This wasn't chaos, it was governance by desire. The crown perfected control through temptation, turning the royal bed into a battlefield where alliances were forged with kisses and power measured by proximity to the king's pleasure. Every banquet hid bureaucracy, every seduction had a file, every scandal a price. What history paints as romance was, in truth, a ledger of exploitation, an industry of intimacy polished until it glittered like virtue. The grandeur of Versailles was not merely architectural, it was psychological. A palace designed to seduce obedience. Every wall shimmered with gold leaf, but the true design lay in how it choreographed human desire. The corridors themselves were weapons, forcing courtiers to pass through layers of ritual humiliation before approaching the king. It was said that even the breath of proximity to Louis XIV was a privilege, and people spent fortunes just to watch him eat. Yet this theater of etiquette was not about manners, it was about mastery. The royal bedchamber was not private, it was the epicenter of power. When the king rose each morning, the lever du roi, dozens of nobles waited by rank to help him dress, to kiss his sleeve, to touch the linen that brushed his skin. The act was sacred, but the sanctity was deception. Every gesture reinforced hierarchy. The closer your hand came to the body of the monarch, the higher your worth. In Versailles, touch was politics. To serve was to surrender yourself. Young women brought to court, daughters of minor nobles, often 16 or younger, were told that their beauty was their weapon. They were trained not in books, but in the choreography of seduction, how to drop a fan, how to bow without seeming eager, how to speak in suggestive riddles that allowed the powerful to pretend innocence. The queen herself was not immune. Marie-Thérèse of Spain, wife to Louis XIV, lived surrounded by rivals chosen for the king's attention. It was not adultery, it was administration. Mistresses were appointments, and jealousy was expected to remain silent. The system demanded performance, and the king's mistresses were the lead actresses in an endless play of domination. Madame de Montespan, the celebrated mistress of the Sun King, was not simply a lover, she was a political institution. Her apartments were larger than those of ministers, her audiences more influential than councils. She received petitions, distributed favors, and in return offered the illusion of intimacy to the most powerful man in Europe. Chroniclers like the Duc de Saint-Simon recorded these exchanges with a mixture of awe and revulsion. He wrote of nights where the king's pleasures were scheduled like treaties, where carnal acts were bracketed between meetings of state. Yet even this luxury was bound by paranoia. When rumors of witchcraft emerged, accusations of love potions and black masses held to secure royal affection, Montespan fell, her influence erased with one decree. The same system that raised her had institutionalized her downfall. Beneath the marble, the machinery hummed quietly. Versailles ran on information. Every whisper had value. The cabinet secret, a network of royal informants, documented not treason but desire. Love letters were intercepted, servants bribed to recount intimacies, and reports of infidelity delivered directly to the royal police. The Lieutenant General de Police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, compiled ledgers so detailed they read like autopsies of souls. 2 noblewomen engaged in indecent behavior after the ball, subject to warning. 1 chambermaid of excellent form, age 15, newly arrived from Brittany, recommended for discretion. These were not rumors, they were files. The bureaucracy of pleasure rivaled the bureaucracy of war. And then there was the Parc aux Cerfs, the hidden garden of flesh. Under Louis XIV, the system reached its most perverted efficiency. Behind the gilded gates of Versailles, a separate palace operated in secrecy. It was euphemistically called the Deer Park, a private residence where young girls were brought for the king's amusement. Some were as young as 13, procured through intermediaries under the promise of education or employment. In reality, they were catalogued, numbered, and rotated like livestock. The registers described them by age, hair color, temperament, and pliancy. The king, aged and ill, sought youth as cure, believing vitality could be absorbed through innocence. The priests looked away. The courtiers laughed softly. Each girl, after her usefulness waned, was married off with a dowry of silence. A few received pensions, most disappeared. This was not mere decadence, it was infrastructure. The Parc aux Cerfs was funded by public treasury, its staff salaried through ministries. The logistics were chillingly modern: recruitment agents in provincial towns, coded correspondence to avoid scandal, and a chain of command ensuring deniability. The king was shielded by euphemism. His pleasure was called divine privilege. When one girl, named Jeanne Bécu, emerged from this system and rose to become Madame du Barry, the last royal mistress, she carried with her the ghosts of hundreds who could not speak. Even she, the glittering favorite, knew the price of survival. To be seen is to be consumed, she once said, her beauty both armor and sentence. But the rot went deeper. The education of women at court, especially in institutions like the Maison Royale de Saint Louis founded by Madame de Maintenon, was cloaked in piety. In reality, these schools were grooming grounds, teaching obedience, modesty, and how to serve without question. Girls were lectured on virtue while being prepared for roles as courtiers, companions, or mistresses. Their hymns masked their purpose. Records show that model pupils were often presented at court under sponsorship, a polite term for evaluation. The more refined the girl, the higher her market value. Religion became the pretext for possession. Contemporary observers hinted at this double morality. The philosopher Voltaire, himself no stranger to court intrigue, called Versailles the most beautiful cage in Europe. He understood that the court's elegance was not accidental. It was anesthetic. The chandeliers, the silks, the endless rituals, all were designed to distract from the transaction at its core. Pleasure was political, and pain was its shadow. To survive was to participate, to learn the language of flattery so fluently that even degradation could be mistaken for grace. Yet beneath the laughter and the music, the victims remembered. Some left traces, letters hidden in monastery walls, diaries written in coded language. One such letter, discovered in the 19th century, from a servant named Elodie, described the court's cruelty with chilling simplicity. "We smile because silence feeds us. They take our virtue and pay us with powder and lace. When they tire, we vanish like perfume." The words might as well have been an epitaph for an entire generation. As the 18th century dawned, France's royal depravity evolved into administration. Louis XIV's reign perfected what Louis XIV had built: a monarchy sustained by erotic hierarchy. The courtiers, once competitors for the king's attention, now became instruments in a greater machinery of desire and deception. Seduction was not a scandal, it was statecraft. The police reports of the Ancien Regime reveal an astonishing fact: more resources were dedicated to monitoring private morality than public poverty. The royal archives include lists of mistresses, courtesans, and even priests implicated in indecencies of the flesh. Their names, preserved in immaculate handwriting, illustrate a paradox: sin recorded as duty. Madame de Pompadour, the king's chief mistress for nearly 2 decades, embodied this transformation. Intelligent and ambitious, she understood that the only way to survive within the system was to master it. She curated herself like an artifact. Her gestures rehearsed, her smiles timed, her tears calculated. To the king she offered not only pleasure but stability. Even after illness ended their intimacy, she maintained her position by providing new companions for him, selected and trained from among her protégés. This was not affection, it was governance. The cabinet secret du Roi used her salons to gather intelligence from foreign envoys, turning flirtation into espionage. The boudoir became the war room. Yet for every pompadour who thrived, thousands vanished into the shadows of the system. The archives of the Hôpital Général in Paris record anonymous girls brought in for correction, their crimes listed as incontinence or familiarity with nobles. They were branded, confined, or forced into convents that functioned as moral prisons. Many had been servants dismissed after pregnancy, others were scapegoats for scandals that had to be erased. The hypocrisy was staggering. While the court held orgies disguised as balls masqués, women of the lower classes were flogged for impropriety. The moral order was geometry, strict for the powerless, elastic for the privileged. In 1774, when Louis XVI inherited the throne, the machinery of pleasure had become self-aware. Versailles was drowning in gossip pamphlets, each one turning private depravity into public theater. Anonymous writers described royal orgies, some exaggerated, others painfully accurate. The people of Paris began to see their monarchs not as divine, but as diseased. The revolution was not born only of hunger, it was born of humiliation. When citizens shouted for liberty, they also shouted against centuries of voyeurism. They were done being spectators to the endless parade of noble appetites. But long before the guillotine, the warning signs were written in ledgers. Economists of the era noted an absurd expenditure, vast sums allocated to maintenance of royal companions. A single year under Louis XIV saw more money spent on the upkeep of mistresses than on entire regiments. The state literally financed pleasure as policy. It was systematic, quantified, bureaucratized depravity. When famine struck, and people starved outside the gilded gates, the contrast became unbearable. Psychologically, the court's perversion lay not only in what it did, but in how it justified it. The royal confessor would bless indulgence as divine right. The philosophers, dependent on patronage, cloaked criticism in allegory. The entire intellectual class learned to write with double tongues. Even love became a metaphor for power. To say "I serve" was to mean "I surrender." And the body, especially the female body, was the document upon which history signed its cruelty. Archaeological digs at Versailles in the modern era reveal small traces, rooms sealed off, hidden corridors, secret staircases connecting private chambers. These architectural remnants confirm what the letters only suggest: the palace itself was engineered for concealment. Behind every mirrored wall, a door. Behind every door, a secret. In one chamber, restorers found iron rings embedded into wood panels, their purpose unknown. But the pattern matched descriptions from Lorraine's police reports, which mentioned devices for discretion. The walls of Versailles were not silent, they were complicit. To call it perversion is to understate the method. It was psychological warfare masquerading as pleasure. The monarchy understood that control was not maintained by fear alone, it required fascination. Subjects who envied their masters were less likely to rebel. The splendor of Versailles, its endless ceremonies, its perfumed rituals, all were designed to mesmerize. Even those who suffered under it participated in its myth. Mothers still sent their daughters, hoping for favor. Priests still blessed unions born of coercion. Systematic depravity had become culture. And yet, within that machinery, humanity flickered stubbornly. A few voices dared to whisper dissent. The philosopher Diderot wrote of a court that gilds its sins and baptizes its shame. Madame du Barry herself, before her execution, reportedly wept not for her wealth but for the countless nameless girls who served and were forgotten. It was a rare moment of clarity from within the system, a confession that the palace of pleasure had always been a mausoleum of innocence. When revolution came, the reckoning was not symbolic. The guillotine did not just sever heads, it decapitated an ideology. The courtiers who once bowed for favor now begged for mercy. Yet even in ruin, the myth of Versailles persisted. Visitors still gasped at its beauty, rarely imagining the ledgers beneath the gold, the files marked confidential, the corridors that smelled faintly of powder and despair. The most chilling truth is that the system did not end, it evolved. Power still wears perfume. Exploitation still hides behind elegance. The archives remain rows of inked parchment preserving names reduced to numbers, pleasures recorded as transactions. They whisper through the centuries, each entry a wound that refuses to close. Entry number 27, one ledger reads, Maid of Gascony 16, presented to the king, found unsuitable. No further note. No record of what became of her. History forgets her name, but the paper endures. It is the coldest cruelty of all, that bureaucracy remembers what compassion erased. The mirrors of Versailles still gleam. Tourists photograph the Hall of Mirrors, unaware that it once reflected not only kings, but countless faces stripped of will. Each reflection remains trapped in the glass, a silent testament to how beauty can be engineered to hide the grotesque. And when you stand there, surrounded by the echo of applause and chandeliers, you might hear it too, the faint rustle of silk, the sound of someone being priced. By the twilight of the Bourbon dynasty, the depravity of France's royal court had ceased to be indulgence. It had become doctrine. What had begun as private indulgence under Louis XIV matured into a calculated engine of dominance by Louis XIV, and finally rotted into farce under Louis XVI. The machine fed upon itself. Courtiers who had once sought power through virtue now sought it through visibility. The king's favor could no longer be earned by loyalty or intellect, only by proximity to the spectacle of pleasure. Versailles had become a cathedral of desire, its priests perfumed and its relics human. Within this gilded cathedral, the transformation of sin into ceremony was almost perfect. The Fêtes Galantes, those ballets of seduction staged beneath frescoed ceilings, blurred the line between art and exploitation. Guests arrived masked, the anonymity granting them courage to perform acts they would not dare in daylight. But there were no true masks. Every movement was documented by spies of the cabinet's secret. The king's agents reported who lingered near whom, whose glances lasted too long, whose smiles trembled with intent. Pleasure was recorded like taxes. One report from 1750 lists the night's notable pairings, with chilling precision: Duchess de Sy and Viscount Dock, observed departing terrace at 1:30. Duchess wept. Viscount paid her carriage. Beneath the powdered faces, the human heart became data. To maintain this empire of temptation required a theology. Court confessors twisted scripture to sanctify lust, preaching that to please the monarch was to serve divine order. The king was God's mirror, and thus to satisfy him was no sin. Even punishment became eroticized. When a noblewoman fell from grace, she was not exiled to darkness but paraded in humiliation, her jewels confiscated, her name whispered as a cautionary tale. The spectacle of shame reinforced control. The audience learned the lesson. Virtue was vulnerability, compliance, survival. At its core, the system thrived on conversion, turning victims into participants. Many of the young women brought to Versailles as companions became recruiters themselves. They learned that to resist meant erasure, but to comply meant privilege. Thus, the perversion perpetuated itself. The royal mistresses established networks of scouts. Governesses, seamstresses, abbesses paid to identify suitable candidates. Some were offered false apprenticeships, others spiritual guidance. Each was catalogued and graded, their worth distilled into ledgers with columns for age, complexion, demeanor. It was industrialized selection disguised as grace. One physician, Dr. Lamartinière, described in his notes how the king's attendants rotated the girls to preserve freshness, ensuring no single face aged too quickly before the monarch's eyes. He wrote this as if documenting livestock care, not human trauma. The coldness of such language exposes the true horror. This was not madness, it was management. Even the architecture mirrored this efficiency. Corridors built for discretion, staircases leading to private apartments, hidden galleries for observation. Versailles was a labyrinth designed to conceal the very sins that sustained it. Each door opened into another layer of secrecy. To walk through those halls was to travel through the anatomy of control itself. And outside the gates, France starved. Bread riots broke out in 1770, yet the Menu Plaisirs du Roi, the royal department responsible for festivals and bedroom arrangements, received its full budget. The government quite literally financed spectacle over sustenance. The same wagons that carried food for soldiers carried silk for mistresses. The state had become the theater, and its audience, the suffering masses, could only watch from afar, their hunger growing alongside their hatred. The illusion of divine right had turned carnal. The king's body was the kingdom's altar, his desire the law. But as every empire learns too late, what is worshipped in excess becomes detested in time. The perfume of Versailles had begun to sour. The final act of France's royal depravity unfolded not in secret chambers, but in the streets. By the late 1780s, the whispers of the parka serfs and the orgies of Versailles had become common gossip, printed in pamphlets that flooded Paris like a moral plague. These pamphlets, libelles, accused the Queen, Marie Antoinette, of every imaginable vice, incest, witchcraft, and seduction. Most were lies. Yet they carried the weight of truth because the people had seen too much. For centuries, the monarchy had trained France to believe that pleasure was its divine right. Now, the mirror shattered, and the reflection turned monstrous. The sacred corruption, as one anonymous writer called it, was the idea that sin could sustain order, that beauty could excuse cruelty, that the suffering of the many was the price of the few's ecstasy. Versailles embodied it perfectly. Every column, every tapestry, every chandelier was funded by laborers who slept in mud. And when the people finally rose, they didn't just want bread, they wanted vengeance. They wanted to burn the golden veil that had mocked them for generations. Even as the revolution gathered momentum, the royal court continued its pageantry. In 1789, mere weeks before the storming of the Bastille, Versailles hosted a masquerade where nobles dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses, pretending to live simply among the peasantry. It was meant as harmless play. It became prophecy. When the Queen curtsied in her silk gown, she bowed before the storm she could not yet see. As mobs surrounded the palace months later, witnesses wrote that the air smelled of both perfume and gunpowder. The same halls that once echoed with laughter now rang with boots and gunfire. The people burst into the Queen's chambers, shredding her curtains, touching the fabrics that had once hidden such silent atrocities. One soldier reportedly shouted, "This is the womb of France's rot," before smashing a mirror. In that instant, centuries of manipulation collapsed. The sacred corruption had consumed its architects. But what makes this climax most horrifying is not the blood that followed, it is how the system tried to survive. Even in exile, even in the shadow of the guillotine, nobles wrote love letters, plotted seductions, and preserved their etiquette as if lust could ward off extinction. The monarchy's final defense was denial, pretending that refinement was innocence. They could not comprehend that the same elegance they worshipped was their executioner. And yet, the legacy endured. The revolution destroyed the palace's power, but not its mythology. The allure of Versailles, its chandeliers, its whispers, its perfumed deceit, still captivates millions. Tourists walk those marble floors unaware that beneath them lie the bones of the exploited, the silenced, the forgotten. The walls have been scrubbed clean, the mirrors polished, but the ghosts remain. Pause and consider. This was not a single tyrant's sin, nor the whim of lustful kings. It was a civilization's creed, that domination can masquerade as grace, that intimacy can be weaponized to rule. The royal court of France perfected that creed until it became indistinguishable from faith itself. And when the guillotine fell, it was not vengeance that cut, it was balance. The system that had once turned pleasure into policy was finally devoured by its own reflection. History remembers the revolution as fire and freedom. But before the flames came perfume. Before liberty, there was the ledger. And before the roar of the crowd, there was the whisper of silk, the quiet transaction that built a world where beauty was bought with suffering. When the smoke of revolution cleared, the mirrors of Versailles still stood. Cracked, darkened, but intact, like the memory of an old sin that refuses to fade. The palace that once ruled by seduction became a museum of regret. Visitors walked its halls in silence, their footsteps echoing where laughter and weeping once mingled. And yet, if you listen closely, the air still hums with the residue of those centuries, the perfume that never left, the sighs that never died. Versailles endures because it was never just a place, it was a philosophy. A testament to how civilization can sanctify corruption when dressed in silk and scripture. The ledgers remain inked records of the royal police, lists of names reduced to statistics. They endure as cold proof that the monarchy's perversions were not rumor, but routine. 17 presented, 12 selected, 5 dismissed. Each number once had a face, a family, a heartbeat. And though the bodies have long turned to dust, the bureaucracy of their exploitation survives in parchment and ink. The archives whisper through the centuries, reminding us that power, when left unchecked, feeds on beauty until beauty becomes its justification. The tragedy of France's royal court is not only that it fell, it's that it taught the world how to disguise domination as refinement. Every age since has carried a fragment of that lesson. The powerful still build palaces of spectacle, though now they glow with glass and screens instead of gold. The same old rituals of gaze, envy, and control repeat in subtler forms. And, just as then, the price is paid by the voiceless. Versailles was merely the rehearsal. But remembrance can be rebellion. To look upon the palace now with clear eyes is to strip its splendor of illusion. It is to see not the chandeliers, but the faces reflected in their crystals, not the marble floors, but the footprints of those who walked unwillingly across them. Every monument to power conceals a mausoleum of its victims. If this history stirs you to vigilance, subscribe and share where it hit hardest in the comments. We'll confront the next buried truth together. Because the past is not gone, it only sleeps beneath polished stone. And when we speak its name aloud, the silence trembles. Versailles still stands, not as a palace, but as a mirror, and in its reflection we see ourselves.